Hello, today we'll be talking with Professor Jerome Krase from the Department of Sociology at Brooklyn College. Professor Krase is both an activist and scholar whose work mainly focuses on Brooklyn, but also various other neighborhoods and ethnic groups in New York City. Professor Krase also researches and lectures extensively on urban life and culture globally. Thank you so much for making time to talk with me today, Professor. I'm really excited to get some insights from you. And before we begin, I would just like to ask a background question about you and your motivations. So what was your inspiration to become an expert in sociology and gentrification? Do you have perhaps a personal connection to it?
Yeah, it's nice of you to refer to me as an expert. That's always a compliment to us. Yeah, my interest in housing and in neighborhoods does have a personal connection, as I usually write in a lot of the works that I have, the reflexive statements. And I was born in the Red Hook housing projects in Brooklyn, and over the many decades have moved, as we say, up and outward from poverty. And of course, I wasn't a sociologist at that time, but it was easy to realize how important and how much the neighborhood that one lived in impacted on one's life and one's life's chances. In terms of the schools that you were going to, in terms of the reputation that you and your family had, having to do with where you live. So we moved from the housing project, not because we got wealthy, but because there were 7 children in the family, and as the children moved out of the household, they didn't have we had to give up a big apartment, and we became superintendents of a small apartment building in a changing neighborhood, which people now refer to as Prospect Heights. But at the time, because the neighborhood was changing, becoming blacker, it was referred to as Bedford-Stuyvesant. And you're too young to realize that in those days, any place in Brooklyn where African Americans or Afro Caribbeans lived was called Bedford-Stuyvesant. I mean, it got to be Bedford-Stuyvesant, got to be huge because of this, because of that stigma. And so it's on and on. I've gone through it. And then when I became a sociologist and started doing my research, and particularly my PhD research at NYU, I studied neighborhoods. I began by studying Greenwich Village, and then I realized that was less interesting than studying the neighborhood in which I lived, which was Prospect Lefferts Gardens. At that time, that was kind of on the edge of Bedford-Stuyvesant. It was in Flatbush, and I remember people in those days talking about how, in fact, I remember. You might be interested in this kind of thing. I remember actually a priest in a church that I stopped going to talking about the black cloud that was moving into the neighborhood. And that kind of put my wife and I off at that particular point. But so that's what it, how it went, and I became an activist more than a scholar in the beginning, and so it went on from there. So I've been writing about and photographing. I do a lot of visual sociology about neighborhoods really around the world, not just simply take pretty pictures, but to relate those scenes to social issues, whether it's immigration or gentrification or racial bias, environmental issues, etc. So that's a long-winded introduction, but you asked for it, so.
I read about your book that you co-authored with Judith DeSena on race, class, and gentrification in Brooklyn. And I read about the decline that you saw in the 1970s and then the rapid subsequent development in Brooklyn that you saw into more of an upscale borough. So, as someone who's lived through it and as someone who studies it, what would you say, how did the changes in population and economics at the time associated with gentrification change the perception of Brooklyn, by the global community as well as the indigenous community?
Yeah. It's a very interesting, it's a good question. It's a question that often is not asked, right? And so what I try to say, try to write, and I'm glad you mentioned my co-author Judy DeSena, who is as involved in these kinds of issues as I have, even though she's a few years younger. She would say she's much younger, but and it's interesting that we sociologists or we social scientists that study these kinds of problems, I think forgets sometimes how much we contribute to them, right? And so my sense, for example, in the 1960s and 70s, writing about and talking about the decline of cities and the decline of Brooklyn, et cetera. Even though these were nice liberal people, et cetera, the impact of their work without reflection, they thought they were doing a good thing, added to this perception, this correlation between the occupation of territory and by people of what we now call people of color, and its decline. Okay, it really was a problem. It's something that I got heavily involved in. For example, in Prospect Lefferts Gardens, my first book, Self and Community in the City, was trying to say, and not trying to say, but saying that here was a wonderful neighborhood of some poor African Americans, Afro Caribbean, working class, middle class, but upper middle class and even upper class people of color, was a beautiful neighborhood. Yet it was stigmatized. You couldn't get bank loans, you couldn't get mortgage insurance, you couldn't get insurance, you couldn't get any of these kinds of things, simply because the demographic data showed it was like 80, 90%, African American. They said, things like non-white. I'll tell you right now before I forget to say it. Why do we say people are non-white? It's like a negative. People of color are non-white. Why don't we say that people who are white are non-black? People don't realize, I think, even supposedly intelligent, educated people, how powerful the language is that they use, particularly when it comes from an allegedly left-leaning or liberal source, like the New York Times, by the way, which inadvertently in its real estate pages has been a major contributor to gentrification by writing about, they frequently have this, it's kind of the next neighborhood, and there's no comment in there about, well, this next neighborhood is going to result in the displacement of poor and working class people, whether they're of color or of little or no color, as I describe myself to my students, yeah. So that's the reason, and that's how this thing started. And so as far as Brooklyn was concerned, there was this connection, that it was being stigmatized because of this, this growth of this population of people. And then when it started with the gentrification, then there was a different kind of a sense of, oh, look at this, the artists are moving in, as though, is that a good thing that artists move into a neighborhood? I mean, it's difficult to breathe when you're in a room in those days because there was so much pot. But that's the way it was. It was the kind of thing. Well, it was started in actually in places like Greenwich Village, because Greenwich Village, when it was bohemian, this kind of stuff, and that became an attraction for people who could tolerate living around bohemian people. And then it was the Soho, and then the Soho. Well, because people were attracted to Soho. They then, it was then the Williamsburg phenomenon, then the Greenpoint phenomenon, then, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now it's like Bushwick, and on and on. So that's that's the process. That's the process that I emphasize in so much of my work is the changing image of the area that stimulates change, which in turn stimulates change in the image, which again, it's this process that takes place, but it begins with the issue of stigmatization. And so we live in a society which continues to be, despite all of the self-laudatory press about the was it the post-racial world, etc. I remember that joke. And it begins with this idea that we're socialized actually to think about different kinds of people as being positive or negative for a neighborhood, for a job, for who you should marry or not marry, who you should even hang around with and have a talk with. That's essentially where it begins with. So this issue of gentrification, although it's extremely important, right, is really just an extension of a much larger problem in the society in which we live, in terms of how we place different valuations on different kinds of people and different kinds of activity. So
Do you think that the change in perception, the change in the way people viewed Brooklyn or any other neighborhood could serve as a positive source, perhaps of income for local residents, or just a positive
yeah.
for?
Yeah, I know that you read the book because it's part of it's in the book there. So yeah, and there is an argument about it, and my wife and I often one of the few times we don't disagree about things is we talk about this issue of, well, what if gentrification didn't take place, right? And this is the problem that we have. Gentrification is a process really of displacement, right? So what makes it different from simply development, right, is that higher status people push out in one way or another lower status people, right? So then we have to deal with, well, why are they lower status? Why are they in subservient? Why are they less powerful? And that has to do with larger issues in society. So yes, put it this way, not gentrification, but it is possible for Brooklyn to develop positively. In other words, meaning having better housing, having better schools, having more parkland, having a better environment, etc. It is possible. It is possible without displacement, right? However, we live in a society where housing in particular is run as part of a capitalistic market, right? So it's if you had socialized, what I know it's a bad word, but if you had democratic socialism for the basic necessities of life, like housing and health and education, etc., then you could have it. And there are places in the world where, at various times, it has occurred. But there have been some difficulty about it. In the New York City, public housing was one of the very good examples of that. But by the 1970s, with the change in American society, particularly during the Nixon administration, then Reagan, etc., there was a withdrawal of federal and then state and then local support for public housing. And most people think that public housing only was low-income housing, but there was subsidies for housing for working class people or lower middle income. There was subsidies for middle income housing. They had the Mitchell-Lama thing where even reasonably well-off people were getting subsidies. So it can happen. But by the time the 90s came, all of that was kind of put in, we're going to solve our economic problems. If you remember the 1990s, and we may have a similar thing going on today, where said, well, what we got to do is we got to privatize everything, because privatization will lead to, because of the profit motive, et cetera, and competition, all of which is nonsense. it will result in lower costs, and everybody will benefit from it. Now, people talk about that as kind of trickle down, right? Trickle down thing, but it's not even a trickle up. It's a rush up, because what happened in the 90s and has happened since then, et cetera, is once that becomes the meme, for our society, what then occurs is people say, "Oh, okay, well, it's okay for the federal government, state government, and local government to subsidize luxury, right? Because in that process, if you believe in the trickle down, well, the more rich people you have, the more money that poor people will have, and why would they believe that? I mean, it is total nonsense. But it is a powerful idea, continuing to be a powerful idea in the society in which we live. So then we have that kind of question. What if we didn't have gentrification? Well, why is it necessary for gentrification, meaning displacement, right? It has to include displacement, otherwise not gentrification. Going back even to the original idea of what the gentry were. The gentry were people who were property owners. So it was the middle class and property. So gentrification really became from Ruth class and before Ruth class was the idea of urban middle class, being British middle class people acquiring property, acquiring even a little bit of property, uh, which would make them gentry. What they began to do is they began to buy up that kind of property, not big estates, etc., but little bits of property, um, and in that process, displacing the people who had lived there. So it does not, it's not as though it's something God given, which people tend to believe. They tend to think, well, there's nothing you can do about it. That this is what has to happen. So um, we should enjoy the benefits of gentrification. Isn't it nice? That last night, I live in Park Slope on 9th Street, which is super not quite hyper. I mean, everybody now they're into planetary. My friend Loretta Lee's, they're really the gentrification people. Um, but I've lived here since 1985, right? And we've seen these ups and downs in terms of value. But right now, my house, what they're saying is my house is worth $3 million or $4 million, whatever the heck it is. And I at some particular point, I may wind up having to leave, even though I'm reasonably well off, because the real estate tax it will be probably 30, 40 million, $40,000 a year. And again, that's not looked at as an issue for middle class people, even middle class, upper middle class people. So what's happened in this particular place is I watch my middle class neighbors and upper middle class neighbors disappear, and are replaced by two person households, 3-person households, both people married or not married, but sharing a household, but making combined incomes $300,000 and $400,000 a year. They're nice people, but this process winds up making it difficult for less able people to stay in the same neighborhood. It's a wonderful neighborhood, as Prospect Lefferts Gardens now is, which is also quite gentrified in the process, and increasingly non people of non-color. That's the only way I could put it without being insulting. But anyhow, so that's the process. So the improvements can take place. There's no reason why you can't have better transportation and better health care and all this kind of stuff without displacement. And it's very interesting. Also, if you're aware of this, the old ecological phenomenon of the rich pushing out the poor, and then the poor coming in and pushing out the rich, etc. By the way, the poor never pushed out the rich. It was the rich left and left space for the poor to come in, right? So we see this process over and over again. And what we begin to see now is we begin to see less able people, meaning less financially able people, moving towards the fringe or away from the core. So it's a very, very interesting process, that people refer to as the movement of capital. Movement of capital also incurs the movement of social capital, which are people and cultures and social groups. Yeah.
Like everyone knows that there's benefits to rapid urbanization. There's, like you said, better transportation, there's better healthcare. But at what cost, and where do you draw the line between everyone benefits and people get displaced because they can't afford to live where they lived
That's a
before?
difficult question, and
Yeah.
the problem is not addressed, and it really ought to be addressed. It should be a central issue. And I have to say, quite frankly, what happens with politics tends to avoid that issue of the social, right, or the
Mhm.
democratic socialism. I mean, remember Bernie got burned because, I said, sorry for the pun, but he got burned for that connection. And he's not really a pure socialist. He's not that far left. And it has to be confronted, and to see, the social housing. They use that term, I think, in other places in the world. But even then, as the economies become more top heavy, we're more concentrated in terms of wealth, etc. It's kind of odd, I think, odd, that people who have enormous amounts of money want more money. If you want some old-fashioned sociology, this Emil Durkheim had talked about something called organic solidarity in the 19th century, even talking about this. And he thought the organic solidarity was people didn't understand what it was, including a lot of sociologists who wrote about it. And what the organic solidarity was all about is individuals, because he understood that the society was becoming individualistic, is that individuals would at some point understand that their well-being was tied to the well-being of other individuals, and that being intelligent creatures, human beings, right? They would figure that out and begin to cooperate with each other, not because they were forced to, right? But because by cooperating with other people, their life would be better. Meaning, you're living in a society, you have poverty, you may have crime related to that, you have pollution, etc., all of which have to do with excesses within the economic and social system. So wouldn't you want to live in a world where you could walk down the street and not worry that somebody's going to hit you over the head and take your money? This is a simple thing, but it's not presented that way. So what people in our society tend to do, and this is one of the excesses of the gentrification, is what they mean by the super and the hyper. Is that, well, you're in a neighborhood. Oh, it's nice being in a neighborhood because we have some working class people still here. It's nice to go down and see people who had smoking cigarettes on the corner or whatever. But that gets more and more restricted, and then eventually gets to the point where you essentially have a closed, guarded community. I can't remember who it was, but people talking about the citadels of the wealthy into your neighborhood who aren't of the same social class. So people coming in to bring you stuff, from Uber. Or people coming in to clean your house. Again, you're very nice, and they're coming to take care of your children and do this and that. And you're saying to yourself, well, gee, isn't this wonderful that what I'm doing is I'm supporting all these poor people? No, what it is, you're creating the conditions which create the economy so that these people are like that. The gig economy, particularly. I remember when they talked about the gig economy that was so great. It's not so great. Well, anyhow.
We are focused pretty heavily on Washington Heights and Columbia's medical school.
Mhm.
And a huge aspect of, the gentrification that ensued due to the building of the school and the continued expansion of the school is that it's creating jobs and it's creating employment opportunities.
Yeah, it's a much wider problem. We'll focus on Columbia, or at least on the west side, etc. But you should know that they all do that. NYU has done it. All of the private institutions. In fact, I wrote a comment today in the Gothamist about the problem New York. Eric Adams is now talking about, well, New York City is going to have an economic problem. And what he's talking about is essentially he's cutting jobs, cutting wages, cutting for basically for working class, middle class, etc. people, without recognizing that there's one under Bloomberg and then De Blasio, was this extension of giving tax abatements, essentially for building luxury housing in places where there was no need for incentive. Manhattan is there; you don't need any incentive there, and yet they did it. And so you had billions and billions, tens of billions of dollars worth of real estate that wasn't being taxed.
Mhm,
And much of those benefits were not going to people who were living in New York City anyhow, but they're foreign investors, etc. And then beyond that, there's a huge amount of an untaxable property in New York City in supposedly nonprofits. All right. But if you're able to look at the books, and you're not allowed to in most cases, particularly for religious organizations,
mhm,
they're actually making profits, because what they basically do is they don't show a profit because they spend the money that they make. They can give themselves large salaries, benefits, etc., limousines, etc., and that includes places like Columbia. Right. So Columbia as an educational institution, then there are health institutions, those are hospitals, etc. Um, um, you know, Cultural institutions, which we love, etc., museums, etc., all of which are tax exempt. Interesting for somebody to do a study to find out how much property, what's the proportion of the property in that are rateable but tax exempt in a place like Manhattan, right? And so that those kinds of benefits. So Columbia has been expanding for quite a long period of time. Some people have said that Columbia at least has a better sense, of what it's doing. So they can talk about, well, we're providing jobs, we're providing services, people work on the campus. As we create more dormitories, et cetera, we have to have people to take the garbage out, et cetera, et cetera. And if they were paying good wages, actually, it's not a bad idea, right? So if you're paying beyond living wages for this kind of stuff, it wouldn't be so bad. But the tendency is, because it is profit oriented, right? It's not going to do that. It's not going to pay the guy who cleans the dormitory $100,000 a year,
mhm,
and it's not going to provide them with right in the same way that's not providing its graduate assistants and other people with a living wage. And they say, well, it's worth a lot of money because they're not paying tuition. But your tuition is you're not losing anything when you're not charging tuition. Um, yeah, so that is an issue. It can be done, and again, it can be done properly. Why not be, if you're doing this expansion, etc., use some of that money and some of that development to improve the housing in the Washington Heights, so that the people who are there are not going to be displaced. Because
mhm,
remember, even if you do a nice thing, what's going to happen in the capitalist mode of housing that we have, by improving the area around the heights, you're going to be attracting more able people. And what they will do essentially is they'll take 1,000 square feet of residential space, which may have 5 or 6 people, and that will be for 1 or 2 people.
mhm,
There's, in fact, the Times had an interesting. Every once in a while, the Times does something which discloses something that they should have known about the development of luxury housing. They used Manhattan as an example. about how this takes place, and what I just described, it takes place. Is you're taking space where more people used to be and only a few, and that has to, it's like as I explain to my students, when you get into a bathtub, right? And if you fill that water up all the way to the edge and get into the tub, the water's going to fall out. That's the displacement. That's where the term basically comes from. And the bigger you are, I hate to say it, the more water is going to go out, right? And so if we think about that, it's not simply the number of apartments, but the amount of space that you take, right? And the amount of space is also can be translated into rental, and cost. Yeah, so it can be done more equitably, you know,
Mhm.
right? So that's another thing I do with my students all the time: difference between equality and equity. But what do people deserve? That's why you had read this book, but I just did an article on 500 years of essentially exploitation of Black Brooklynites. They changed the title because I think it was too controversial. I think, but you're talking about gentrification, and talk about the Heights. Talk about the Bodequeños and Dominicanos that invaded that area as all of the Los Blancos left, right? Uh,
Mhm.
they basically saved that neighborhood, right? Because they lived there, and the housing was filled, and there was activity, and there was business, and there was this,
Mhm.
there was that, etc. Well, the same thing is true in Brooklyn. That Bedford Stuyvesant analogy that I mentioned. That's some of the best housing in Brooklyn was preserved by African Americans and Afro Caribbeans. So in terms of equity, which refers to what is owed to people, right? We owe these. I hate the people of color stuff. We hate. We owe these people an enormous amount, right? I hate. There's another word that should be used. There's urban reparations. It's not just simply for slavery, right? But for what happened to these people as they came here, and
Mhm.
how they were exploited in so many different ways, etc. Even as right, let me rant here a little bit. Even as holders of property, right? Even if they didn't own it, right? They held it, for the next process, which is gentrification. So in a sense, they were part of the economic system, right? Creating wealth, and then as that the value of the space that they occupied but didn't own, right? If they had owned it, right, and so we can go back to another phenomenon. You had it up in the Upper West Side also. They couldn't get mortgages, right? There was also redlined areas. You couldn't get stuff. They used to do. That's where you saw a lot of this. These private and town and all kinds of stuff where they would lend money to each other. It's also why you had so much in terms of you know the exploitation of people in terms of having to borrow, right?
Mhm.
And so it's very much a part of the economic system that's not recognized, right? So you live in an apartment for 10 years, and then it becomes worth $4 million, and then you're forced out, but you are not getting any of that value, right? But
Mhm.
by you living there, I mean, by you occupying the space, it was worth something.
A family has been preserving a single property, and then if you take into account the entirety of that neighborhood being preserved by families like such, and
Mhm.
then being forced out, where's the equity in that
There isn't. I
displacement?
mean, it's totally inequitable.
Mhm.
Even though you have nice, nice plays and movies like In the Heights, etc.
Mhm.
And again, that's a cultural aspect of it also. You have to think about that as a contribution. People say, oh, right now there's lots of people say, oh, let's go to the heights. Well, you better get to the heights before it's gone. And it has occurred in many places. We know that in the Caribbean areas and Brooklyn, some of the African American places, etc. There was I remember, I'm trying to remember back, there's too much to remember. But Spike Lee, I think, had made a statement one time, and it was, again, I think maybe it may have been in the New York Times, where people who had moved into a neighborhood started complaining about the noise, and so what Spike Lee was talking about was that, and this is what I'm alerting to the culture. I'll
Mhm.
give you an example. I've grown up with diverse kinds of stuff, but I remember when I was living in PLG, and we were going one of our meetings and stuff like that. We were going to meet in a house of a Caribbean. I think they were Jamaican. It may have been Barbadian or whatever. And we were going to go over to meet at that house. After the guy said after dinner,
Mhm.
so we went over there at like 6:30, 7 o'clock. Of course, they weren't eating dinner until like 8. You know, there's different cultures have different senses of time, or when is appropriate, etc. This kind of stuff. You also have different senses of music, different senses of sound, how late you stay up at night, all this kind of stuff is very, very different. Okay. And so, what Spike Lee had talked about is that somebody who had moved into the neighborhood was upset because somebody was playing the saxophone, at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night, etc. And in the old Bed-Stuy areas and the old Fort Greene areas, etc. And a lot of other poor and working class neighborhoods, people go outside, particularly in the summertime, and they sing and they play and they make music, etc. And it's to some people it's noisy, to other people it's culture,
Mhm.
right? And that's also a contribution that the Upper West Side did also with the Latinos and Latinx. Now there's
Mhm.
the new controversy over whether it's Latino or Latinx or Latina. Anyhow, I have to deal with these things all the time. But as another contribution, what's the value of that? What's the value of that? The value of it is you can look at it in terms of how it is appropriated and sold, and whether it's any of that's given back.
I would love to learn so much more about the way that culture was created in Washington Heights and the way it has been preserved. And I know that you use several, interviewing styles and participant observations to get a better understanding of the way that culture was developed over time. So, what would you say would be the most effective and something that could be reproducible to gauge, like you said, the way that these communities have created that culture, preserved it, and how it's perceived?
Yeah. Again, you're young enough that to be around for a while. But in the Upper West Side, again, I'm not an expert on the Upper West Side, but I can pretend to be. Right? There are lots of cultural organizations, both formal and informal organizations. They probably have some connection to the folkloric groups and the music groups, and you have a ton of places in the Upper West Side, restaurants, bars, nightclubs. That's a big scene, right?
Mhm.
Um, Salseros, dance groups, all kinds of stuff that exist. So it's easy to start out, by identifying those places and lining up interviews with people in music, in arts, in dance, etc. That's more or less formally, informally to do it. But what would be most important, I think, right? Not that what I think makes any difference, would be as you talk to those people, is to get them to refer to the informal
Mhm.
stuff, where you would find, as I was just mentioning to you, people on the stoops, people in the parks, people in the whatever, you know, emulating the culture where they came from. Where if
Mhm.
you go to what they refer to as the DR, etc., you'll see this stuff, right? And I remember going. Haven't gotten to Dominican Republic, but I've been to Puerto Rico a number of times, and walking around. People, there's a little gathering on the street. Usually, again, late at night. I mean, it's a different kind of a world, and somebody's playing guitar, there's somebody's singing, somebody's this, and somebody's that. Um, and that's I think that would be the way to go, because that's the basis, right? In other words, so it's the appreciation for the creations of the culture that provide the base for the other things which are more formal, right? So if they'll say, well, so and so is going to be playing at the such and such, next week, we all got to go. There's going to be a dance party at so and so, whatever, and that kind of stuff. And I realize that's the large culture, right? That creates the interest in and support for the more formal stuff that the people outside the community would be familiar with. Everybody goes, oh, I know so and so. He played at Madison Square Garden. Oh, we had a concert here. We had a concert there. Oh, he was at the Emmys. He did this and he did that. But that's not the culture. The culture is the base,
Mhm.
right? Culture is the base that provides this support, so that the kids grow up in that, and then they become, oh, and they're interested in this, and they experiment and they sing and they dance, etc. And then what we see is we just see the result of that. But that would be great for you to do, and
Mhm.
also to find, I would assume, in there, also other kinds of arts, other kinds of arts, whether recognized or not recognized, the people who are doing the murals, the vernacular landscape that I've always been so interested in, and how those things are done. How people decorate. What kind of gardens you have up there. I'm assuming that they have some of those little gardens, casitas.
Mhm.
Yeah, and you can go in them, and then usually you'll see the stuff that's there. You should also look into, don't invade anybody's privacy, but the practices, the different religious practices that they have there beyond the formal Roman Catholic Church, etc. You have a lot of small churches that are there, etc., and the Santeria and whatever. And you probably have places where they're selling, the trinkets and the this and the that, and storefront places, etc. That's all part of the culture. So
Mhm.
that's all part of it, and it'll be you'll have a good time too with it, because
Yeah.
what I found among people like that all over the world is if you know how to smile, right? And it's easier for a woman, by the way, for it, because you tend to be less, although you could be an extremely aggressive person, people tend to think that you're not. You'll be accepted, and you might start with the women. The women are the women in every. You'll find out from Judy DeSena if you ever get to interview her. You'll find that the females in particular, the women, tend to be the entry into the community. But you can get entry in that way, and it would be very nice. I think. If not, uh, don't blame me.
Conversation that we had about the preservation of neighborhoods sparked a question be about, entitlement. And I think that there's, a slight dichotomy between who's entitled to the neighborhood. I feel like the whether it be the Dominican communities or the Afro-Caribbean communities, whatever it is, they have a sense of entitlement towards the culture that they created, whereas the people that are moving into these neighborhoods have an entitlement to this housing because they can afford it or whatnot. So I'm just wondering about how do you, where's the balance between all of these people and all the entitlement that they feel towards the same place?
Well, that's what I mentioned. Why it's not why, but I had mentioned to you this Emil Durkheim,
Hmm.
that notion. I had tried, for example, here in Park Slope, I had been asked to, because some of the sociologists in my department were living in Park Slope, and they were in a very privileged public school, come to talk to them about how they might be able to reach out to the others in the community and all this kind of stuff. Again, they weren't realizing that in doing that, the way that they were phrasing it was also insulting, right? I was there, and that was basically the first thing that I said to them. What they were saying is they had realized that by going into this school and making it so much better and attracting upper middle income families, etc., that they were displacing not only the poor and working class from the neighborhood, but also from that school, right? So
Hmm.
these kids who could have been in that school and could have benefited by all of the resources that these upper middle class people were bringing in, right? They were displaced. Right? In fact, my daughter Catherine, I'll send it to you if I remember. Catherine Krase, she just wrote an article about the white privilege. I mean, she bothers me a little bit about this, and how privileged she is, and talking about schools, etc. I'll send that to you, which is a good point about gentrification. So anyhow, so getting on to the story. So the first thing I said to them, I said, poor and working class people, and I didn't use the people of color at that time because that wasn't the rubric. And I said, you can't really think about how you can use these people to benefit your children. I mean, that's the attitude that they were taking. Let's have a few of these in our classes, so that my kids will get the experience of working with diversity, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how I began the conversation, which of course got a lot of quiet. And then I said, well, what you can do is why not make contact? This was the parents' organization. Why not make contact with the other schools in the district, right, which have these poor and working class, kids that are different from your kids, and work with them and try to figure out ways that they could be brought together for common events, for common programs, maybe, art stuff, or even your better off kids. Maybe your kids can be helping out and tutoring and stuff like that. And, there's all kinds of stuff that you could do. And I also made that suggestion to the Park Slope Civic Council, which all these things go over with a dead balloon, a lead balloon, not a dead balloon, although it was dead. It's the idea that they would be very happy to say, well, okay, we'll raise $10,000 and we'll give it to these people, so that they can hire somebody from, whatever, to do it. But this idea of actually engaging in an organic sense, right, was foreign to them. Was foreign to them, and that's what I would suggest is to see, because they see that that's a benefit for their kids, right? So their kids would benefit by interacting with people.
This sounds similar to what you were talking about earlier about solidarity and cooperation and how, there's a way for everyone to mutually benefit. It's just a matter of finding it, kind of.
Yeah,
Um,
you have to work on it. It's
yeah,
not a given. Yeah.
yeah. Well, thank you so much, Professor.
Mhm.
It was so great talking to you today.